but they can take advantage of platforms like Ginkgo's to actually do the R&D work where they can really focus on the product piece.
How do you think commercial drug discovery in particular is set to change when we look at these platforms?
Some of them eat other snails, some of them eat worms.
This is what got you, huh?
Yeah. No, I thought it was neat. The genome of a cell is fundamentally information, just like zeros and ones are information in the computer.
How do you think the funding landscape has shifted? And are there any types of companies that you think are far more feasible to start today that maybe weren't 10 years ago?
It's a tall order from a science and engineering perspective, but also a mission and a challenge that I think is worthy of great people working on it.
Well, thank you for being here early this Friday morning. I think it's an especially exciting time for us to be having this conversation, given all the news that came out of DC this past week, to see on a public policy level the industry of biotechnology and biomanufacturing being taken more seriously than ever. But before we dive into that discussion on the bioeconomy, I want to give a quick introduction to you. So Reshma is the co-founder and COO of Ginkgo Bio-works, but before that, she was a research student at MIT studying synthetic biology, participating in iGEM, and even before that, a computer science undergrad. And I want to start at that early point. Where did your first interest in biology, as it overlaps with engineering principles, begin? Because from what I read, apparently it had something to do with snails. So
yeah, that's right. I was fortunate enough to end up in a high school summer research program at my local university. And it was this very unique program where they brought in high school students, they taught them some basic lab techniques, and then they let them join a lab for a summer. And I was lucky enough that a professor at the University of Utah Department of Biology, Toto Oliveira, was willing to take on high school students. And so I joined his lab. And his lab studies these venomous cone snails. It's basically these snails that actually live on coral reefs all around the world. So anywhere you go, there a different species of this cone snail might be there. And the neat thing about them is that they're actually venomous. So depending on the snail, some of them eat fish, some of them eat other snails, some of them eat worms.
This is what got you, huh?
Yeah. No, I thought it was neat. Like they literally, if you look at pictures of them, there are literally like some that are like spear hunters. So they literally have a spear that they pierce a fish and inject a paralytic set of toxins to paralyze a fish and then kind of eat it at their leisure. And so, biology at its coolest. There are others that are net catchers and they like swallow, put out a big net, secrete these things that make the fish feel really drowsy and kind of limp and, again, eat them at their leisure. So yeah, biology at its finest.
I asked where you started at the beginning because when I was first introduced to the field of synthetic biology, I realized that it would require me to relearn or unlearn some fundamental assumptions about biology that I'd made from school and in undergrad. So my first favorite big idea or aha moment was realizing that I should look at cells as this active computational agent of life that we can edit and alter rather than this unchanging part of nature in our biology. And I'm curious, what is your favorite big idea about synthetic biology, or what is one such framework that you think we should rethink when we're working in the space?
Yeah, when I got to graduate school, I met Tom Knight, who ended up being my PhD advisor, and he sort of started talking to me about how biology is fundamentally digital, right? The A's, T's, G's, and C's that make up the genome of a cell is fundamentally information, just like zeros and ones are information in the computer. But the unique thing about biology is that it can translate that digital code to physical stuff, right? Atoms. So it is like the ultimate bits to atom compiler, so to speak. And so part of the reason that resonated with me is because I ended up being a computer science student or computer science major in college. And so when Tom sort of started bringing together these two worlds for me, like what I had been studying in school around science and programming computers and whatnot, with the biology I'd been working on in Toto Oliveira's lab, it was kind of mind-blowing. Yeah, like why shouldn't we program biology the way we program computers? Like why is that hard? Now, of course, I later learned that it's actually very challenging, but it remains super exciting to me today. And so that's why I've chosen to continue working in the space.
When you were early on, you met your group of co-founders, or fellow research students at the time, especially given your background in academia. Why did you think starting a company was the best way to solve this problem of engineering biology?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was lucky enough to go to MIT. It's a very special place. I had an amazing time during my PhD. But fundamentally, all of us were really focused and entranced by this problem of how do you make biology easier to engineer? And the reason why that problem motivated us is that we knew what biology was capable of, right? You just have to look out your window and you can see, everything from diatoms in the ocean that can make these like structures with nanoscale precision to, towering redwood forests that are these massive planetary scale, ecosystems, right? And biology is capable of all of it, right? And so the idea that sort of captivated all of us was the fact that if you could learn how to program biology, you could harness all those capabilities potentially and hopefully harness them for good, right? But what was holding us back was not ideas. Like there were plenty of ideas of cool things you could do with biology, plenty of applications, no shortage of things. It was our ability to actually engineer biology, program biology. And so we essentially decided to start a company focused on a mission of making biology easier to engineer because we believed that would unlock all these potential applications. Like we were tools and technologies people, right? We weren't like necessarily focused on, hey, this is one application I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
That problem of making biology easier to engineer was something we had been working on at MIT. And, MIT is a really special place. It has a lot of resources. Everything you do is pretty high profile. But even at a place as privileged as MIT, trying to make something faster, cheaper, easier was just kind of a weird fit for academia, right? Academia is all about doing something new, publishing papers. And that's great. It's important for people to do new things and make discoveries and build new things that have never been built before. But if you want to make something faster, cheaper, easier, that just wasn't something that was very well celebrated in academic environments. And so a startup environment, nobody questions why you want to make something faster, cheaper, easier for people to do. So that's why ultimately it was the problem that motivated us, and we chose a startup as the right sort of mechanism to work on the problem.
You touched on this already in two of your answers, but if I were to think about this from a first principles perspective, the way I would ask the question myself is, what is the most difficult part about engineering biology or programming a cell, and how do I make it easier? And I'm curious, in that decade you spent working on the problem and the decade since, what did you find was the most difficult part of solving that problem you initially set out to answer?
I think the challenging thing about getting good at engineering biology is that there is no one magic bullet, silver bullet technology. Even something as powerful as CRISPR-Cas, I would argue on its own, it's not enough to really unlock the power of biology. It's so for us, the platform we're building at Ginkgo has always been focused on what are the constellation of technologies that we need to bring together to be able to make biology easy to engineer. And that means, software tools and software infrastructure. It means AI and machine learning tools. It means automation and robotics and new instruments that can basically, either manipulate liquids in, either faster or in smaller volumes, or analytical instruments that can measure things more precisely or accurately. And it also means the biology itself. Like, how do you get better at putting together pieces of DNA and putting that DNA into a cell and then selecting which cells perform the way you want? And so because you have to bring it together so many different technologies into an integrated platform, that turns out to be a really hard challenge because it means you have to bring together people with very different backgrounds and expertise, automation engineers, software engineers, product managers, biologists, chemists, chemical engineers, biochemical engineers, you name it, and we probably need it part of our platform. So you're trying to assemble a really big group of people to work on a core common platform where each of them might have different training, different backgrounds, speak different languages, so to speak. But all of them are necessary to achieve this vision. And so it's a tall order from a science and engineering perspective, but also a mission and a challenge that I think is worthy of great people working on it.
One of the interesting things as I was reading about your journey with Ginkgo is I recently turned 23, which I imagine is around how old all of you were when you first founded Ginkgo.
That was about how old I was when I showed up at MIT.
There you go. But then after you found Ginkgo, you spend the next decade working on this problem before, you get those first contracts that lead you to YC. What kept your resolve over the course of that decade? How did you bootstrap for 10 years? Was it a lot of ramen or, you I'm sure had to find unique ways to get access to even the materials that you needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I look back and I think, yeah, we bootstrapped for about 6 years, not 10
Okay.
years. But still, it's a long time, and it's particularly a long time in startup land. But it didn't feel like things were going slowly at the time, I'll confess,
Mm,
right? So every year we were either, landing new contracts or, advancing the platform or bringing new folks onto the team and, just making, progress step by step. Right. And so in the moment, it can feel like you're not making, any forward progress or forward momentum. But then when you sort of really step back and look at it, like we could sort of see that we were making significant steps forward, figuring out what the business could be, figuring out what the technology platform needed to look like and whatnot. And so in retrospect, I'm like, oh my God, that was so long.
the
But
moment.
in the
Yeah.
moment, we felt like it was the right problem to be working on, and it felt like we were making progress. And candidly, being a mission driven company really helped, right? A mission around making biology easier to engineer it's a powerful mission, it's a compelling mission, and it's what candidly convinced a bunch of really talented colleagues to sign up and take this journey with us over all these years.
Thinking about the industry broadly now, one of the things that I hear a lot when I ask other people about Ginkgo, their initial first buzz phrase, it's the AWS of biotech. So I'm curious how you make of that, especially as it relates to this cloud format of doing R&D research, especially at biopharma companies. How do you think commercial drug discovery in particular is set to change when we look at these platforms?
Yeah, it's a great question. Oftentimes there's sort of a model for startups in the biopharma world of, hey, a new technology gets invented in a lab. You launch your company to kind of go and try to, a new drug candidate, right? Whatever its modality. And maybe you're developing a platform alongside it, maybe not. And then typically they'll have a pipeline of assets and usually try to sell themselves to a bigger pharma company. And usually that bigger pharma company is interested in like one or two of the assets. Occasionally they're interested in the platform, but usually they're buying it for, say, the lead asset, right? And to me, it always felt like there was a lot of kind of wasted potential and opportunity there. And again, I say this from the perspective of someone who is, kind of obsessed with tools and technologies, right? Of like,
Yeah.
well, what else could that platform have done? What else could the technology have unlocked, right? And similarly, because these startups in the biopharma space have to focus by necessity on kind of their pipeline of candidates because that tends to be where the value is, and oftentimes they're prioritizing their lead candidate over time. And so their platform ends up being kind of a snapshot of the technology when they started the company. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
if they're lucky, they've reinvested back into it to make the platform better and better, but maybe not. And oftentimes that if they do make that investment, it's in the first few years, but then as stuff progresses to later stages, they really have to focus their capital and their resources and their attention on that lead candidate and progressing it
Mm-hmm.
through the pipeline. And so part of the kind of theory or the model behind Ginkgo is like, well, we're not actually going to have our own clinical pipeline of candidates, right? We're actually just going to focus and put all of our energy, all of our resource, all of our investment into the platform itself. And so that means that we're constantly looking at what new technologies
Mm-hmm.
are coming up out there. We're buying some of those technologies, we're developing some of those technologies in-house. And so we can afford to invest more into our platform because it's not supporting just one clinical candidate or two or three clinical
Reusable.
candidates.
Mm-hmm.
It's we're supporting a whole plethora of customers, and not even in just one sector, right? We work across food and agriculture and biopharma, right? And so our partners can really take advantage of the fact that we're amortizing the cost of this platform investment across so many different cell programs, so many different partners, right? And so they can get access to state-of-the-art technologies without necessarily having to make that fixed upfront investment themselves. They get to use it in their programs that that can really take advantage of it. And so that's part of the value we bring to our partners is like, hey, you get to access all of this, automation and software and intellectual property that we've developed previously in other cell programs for your, product of interest or clinical candidate of interest.
In that question, we touched on two phases, so to speak, of what drug discovery could look like. And when you apply that similar framework to the field of synthetic biology, the way that I've thought about it is it feels like there was this first layer of Synbio with companies like Amyris, and then you go into Ginkgo being a platform-based company of Synbio 2.0. But now I'm sure there's going to be a next iteration of companies that build on top of the work that platforms like Ginkgo have done. Where do you think the next decade of synthetic biology is headed? And are there any parts of this space that you think are potentially already oversaturated, or we're way too early to be thinking about it in that way?
Well, I think we're now have entered an era where there's just going to be like a multitude of applications built on top of biology, right? So, a lot of the kind of first generation of companies in the synthetic biology space from whom we had to learn a lot, they had to vertically integrate and own the whole stack, right? So they were building the platform for engineering biology. They had to figure out how to scale up and manufacture their products. And then they had to go figure out how to formulate those products and put them into, consumer goods or whatever it was. So in a company like Amyris is a great example of that, so they had to own every piece of that vertical stack, right? Now I think with the rise of companies like Ginkgo that are platform companies that can provide, say, hey, you can actually just focus on the application, whether it's the manufacturing piece or plus the formulation piece, and how am I going to actually go sell this biotechnology product out into the market and formulate it into a true something that consumers want. You basically see this rise of what I would call application focused biotech companies, right? Where biotech is at their core. It's how they make their product of interest. It's part of their value add. But actually, the company is made up of experts in the food industry, right? Who think about taste and how, mouthfeel and how things cook on a griddle and things like that. Or you get companies who are experts in kind of the beauty and personal care space, and they think about branding and how do you test if this new product is a sunscreen or not, or makes your hair look smoother or not, right? And so you're seeing this rise of companies where, yeah, they have a little bit of biotech in-house, but they can actually take advantage of platforms like Ginkgo's to actually do the R&D work where they can really focus on the product piece and how to bring those products to market and how to realize the impact and fruits of biotechnology for the world at large.
We touched right at the beginning on some of this news that came out of DC this past week. But before we go to public policy, I think part of what's caused this change is likely a big shift in priorities in private markets as well. So the willingness to take risk and investing in some of these ideas that maybe did not exist at that same scale before. And I'm curious, given, like you said, there's so many opportunities on top of platforms like the ones that Ginkgo has built. How do you think, one, the funding landscape has shifted, and two, are there any opportunities or types of companies that you think are far more feasible to start today that maybe weren't 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think there have been a couple shifts. So one, I think you're seeing a lot of investment in bio or bio-based companies for applications outside of just biopharma. So historically, like the tech investors and the pharma investors were very separate groups. The pharma folks invested in pharma assets only, and then the tech people invested in, tech companies, right? Like software companies usually. And now I think there's enough interest and successes coming out of the bio space that we're seeing more and more investors kind of bleed over, where maybe they do both tech and bio investing, or even specialist kind of bio investors who are just doing kind of the typical pharma investments, but are interested in a broader range of applications. Maybe they're motivated by sustainability and trying to mitigate climate change, or maybe they're just motivated by a new technology frontier. But I think you're seeing kind of a filling in of that landscape in a way that didn't exist, 15 years
10
ago.
years ago, yeah.
Yeah, 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Well, this past week, Biden announced this biomanufacturing and biotech initiative with $1 billion in funding, which is to be led by Dr. Renee, who is a VP of Business Development at Ginkgo. And it's incredibly encouraging, I think, especially as a young person, to see that there's such a federal and policy shift towards tackling these problems really seriously on a national level. I'm curious what your thoughts are on what the future of this bioeconomy could potentially look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been an amazing week. There was a White House summit on biotechnology in conjunction with the executive order that President Biden issued. And I think there's sort of a growing recognition and appreciation that the bioeconomy is kind of a key sphere for economic activity and economic competitiveness, right? And in particular, coming out of the pandemic, it drove home for everyone quite viscerally just how important biology is, right? And, with some of the supply chain challenges, candidly, we've seen over the past few years, there's a increased interest in like, how do we shore up our supply chains? How do we build resilience into our supply chains? And that there's real value in domestic manufacturing capability. Mm-hmm. And so biomanufacturing in particular offers us an opportunity to actually bring manufacturing back to the US and an opportunity to have a more distributed manufacturing base, right? So if you think about most of our products today come from a barrel of oil, but refining oil into various products, whether it's paints or carpets or whatnot, that typically is a very centralized activity, right? You need a big oil refinery in Texas to do that, and it's all about scale. But with biology, biology is inherently distributed, right? And so biomanufacturing gives you an opportunity to have a more distributed and therefore hopefully a more resilient manufacturing base.
When you think about the regulatory or policy environment around biotechnology and biomanufacturing broadly, is there a particular hurdle or new legislation or change that you think could move biotechnology forward far more quickly than it is today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And candidly, the past week has been a great one for bio and biotechnology. And so I'm actually really encouraged in terms of where we are and where we're likely to go. I think from a regulatory standpoint, like we're pretty fortunate in this country that the way our regulatory system is set up is that it's based around how you're using the product of interest and not so much on the method of manufacturing necessarily, except to the extent it influences how the product is used and whether it can be used safely or not for a particular application. So, the FDA regulates the food and the drugs, and the USDA regulates ag products and things like that. And so I think that fundamentally is a sound basis. And I think given both the rise of prominence of biology as well as things like this executive order, there's a growing appreciation that these agencies need to be ready and prepared to look at and review the products of biotechnology. So I'm actually relatively encouraged about where we are. I think the biggest thing that can kill industries is not the fact that there's regulation necessarily. It's when there's regulatory uncertainty, right? If you don't know how a product will be regulated or how regulators will review products, that's what really kills investment in industries. And so to the extent that we can continue to reduce regulatory uncertainty, I think that's enabling of industries.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's contributed to some of those financing trends you discussed earlier as well. A question that I got from a lot of people on Twitter is you transitioned from being a co-founder to COO, which is a more specialized role. And in our conversation today, you've talked about the necessity on some of the problems that Ginkgo is solving to bring such, differently trained people together. One, how did you prepare, or what was that transition like for you to specialize into COO? And then how do you think about bringing smart, talented people that are perhaps very different from each other to work together on the same problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's no kind of I think book you can follow or class you can follow to kind of prepare yourself for a journey like this, I think, but there are a couple like mindsets that you can adopt. And one in particular that we emphasize a lot at Ginkgo is always be learning, right? Even within the sort of technical side, making biology easier to engineer is hard. It's a problem that we don't fully understand what we need to bring to bear on it. And so you have to keep an open mind and always be learning and then, adapting to those learnings. I think similarly, when you're talking about growing from somebody with a technical background into a leader of a company as it grows, you also have to similarly always be learning, right? And so, when we first got started, all of us on paper kind of looked the same. We were all PhDs, right? But we all just sort of ended up jumping into whatever needed doing. So, my co-founder Austin had one accounting class. So in the early days, he took on the finance stuff. And Barry, my co-founder, was a mechanical engineer by training before he got into biology. And so he figured out some of the facilities stuff, right? Jason turned out had a natural talent around investing and telling stories, and he ended up leading a lot of the commercial activity. And so each of us didn't necessarily let what we had been trained in hold us back. It was like, oh, is there a problem to be solved? Okay, I'm going to jump in and figure it out and learn. And we made lots and lots of mistakes along the way, but that's okay. That's how you learn. And very few mistakes are truly irrecoverable. So the important thing is to just be willing to learn from your mistakes and be very willing to go and just talk to people and ask a lot of questions. So I continue to do that to this day.
I want to look to broader future vision. So, as a science fiction nerd, I grew up reading a lot of those books. And one of my favorites was this book called Green Mars, which is by Kim Robinson. And she talks about this concept called veritas, which writer Elliot Hirschberg describes as this desire to propagate a carbon-based future. And when you talk to a lot of people in tech, there's a spectrum that they fall on. There's like the AGI-led metaverse to, what people like Tom Knight have described as this carbon-based future. And I think similarly, having studied computer science, but now kind of interested in synthetic biology and drug discovery, I'm curious, what range of that spectrum do you fall? When you think about the future of what our world could look like, is there a vision that comes to mind for you?
I would say, at Ginkgo, we tend to be pretty excited about what some people call it a solar punk future, right? Like a future where we're sort of living in harmony with nature, but also our engineering nature, right? And so we don't rely on petrochemistry or even civil engineering to kind of build the places we live in and the materials we need to use. We rely on biology. And so it's out there, but it's a cool kind of vision for the future where biology is providing most of the things we need each day, not, oil.
I want to end with, if you were to go back 10 years ago at the beginning of your either grad student journey or when you started Ginkgo, what is advice you would give yourself looking back on all the things you've done? There's a Steve Jobs quote that I live by on some level. You can't connect the dots going forward. You can't predict what's going to happen next. But when you look back, it seems like everything connected together in a way that you might not have expected. So I'm curious if you were to look back at, the dots that led you to where you are today.
It's a great question. And I would say, like, when I look back, the thing I've sort of struck by is some of the biggest turning points or decisions I've made in terms of kind of my life trajectory were not based on where I wanted to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or whatever. It was sort of based on what I found most interesting and compelling in the moment, right? And so one piece of advice I give folks is like, there are some people out there who try to plan out like, well, I'm going to do this now so that in 10 years I can do XYZ, or in 20 years I can be ABC, right? And I think the challenge with that type of approach is that, life has a way of intervening, right? Things happen, things can knock you off course, or you might not get to that XYZ. And so if you choose something in the short term that you hate because you think it'll get you to something you love later, I think the risk is you might never get there. And not because you didn't try hard enough or weren't good enough, but just because life has a way of intervening with our plans, right? And so instead, I generally try to encourage people is like, you have a certain set of opportunities in front of you at any given time. Like, pick the one that is most interesting or compelling or exciting for you to do then. Because I find that when you then make that leap forward, because you find it interesting and compelling or exciting, you're more likely to be invested in it and you're more likely to be successful at it. And then two, it usually opens up the aperture of opportunity to you to things that you might not have ever thought of before, right? And so you never even knew to dream about that thing because it just wasn't on your radar. And so I think about it as like optimizing locally rather than globally in terms of your own path. And so that would be kind of my big advice for folks.
I want to just end our conversation today with what makes you most excited about the future?
When I think back to what we were hoping we would be able to do with biology and now where we are today, I just see that the whole field has just made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of what the technology can do, but also people's appreciation for just how important and fundamental this, biology is. And, culminating in President Biden, right, and his executive order last week, that was a big landmark, I think, for the entire field and industry. And so I'm just excited to see what the next decade will bring.